This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 861 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. It's the fantasy football offseason, which means we're fully in prospect season. The NFL draft is just around the corner. It also means that we're fine-tuning our dynasty rosters. We're looking for players to trade for and to trade away. Over the next 2 weeks, I'll be talking about some players you might want to buy and then some players you might want to sell. Today, we're talking buy candidates. Next week, it's sell candidates. I do want to say that with these shows each year, I really don't want to be obvious. I want to take the market into sincere consideration. Like, it would be pretty easy for me to just sit here today and say, buy Tajay Spears. We're all aware that Spears is probably going to score more fantasy points in 2024 than he did in 2023. It's the same deal for someone like Kendre Miller, just to a lesser scale. But the fantasy football market has gotten smarter. All of that is baked into these players' costs at this point. Maybe a Spears manager isn't aware of his situation, but that seems doubtful. I want to talk about players who I feel like are more sincere buy candidates. When I look at them listed on a site like Keep Trade Cut, and I compare where they're sitting to where I have them ranked, I want to find the guys that my rankings seem to like more. And by the way, you can get my rankings on the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. Check it all out, lateround.com. There aren't like tons and tons of obvious players to choose from here. But I did pick out a handful of players that I think you can buy low right now. And we'll get to those players in just a second. First, I've got to let you know that the Late Round Prospect Guide is available for pre-order. The guide goes through my updated models at wide receiver, running back, and tight end, and then it profiles every running back and wide receiver who are going to be at the combine this year. You get prospect scores for all relevant players too. And there's an entire section on my year 2 model, which I'll talk about on today's show. But that section has player profiles as well for the relevant guys entering the second year of their NFL careers. You can learn more about it, and you can purchase it over on lateround.com. And by the way, while you're there, while you're on the website, check out the Late Round shop. I've got a couple of t-shirts and hoodies for sale after getting requests for them. So go ahead and check that out too and rep the brand. All at lateround.com. I'm going to jump all over the place today, so there's no order to this list of buy candidates. But I want to start with someone who I liked in 2023, and he didn't really come through, and that's Drake London. Now, I do think the market is going to be more bullish on London now that Arthur Smith is out of the picture in Atlanta. I know it might seem like he's one of those guys who's sort of a more obvious pick here. But I'd be willing to bet that I'm still a good bit higher on London versus the market even after this coaching switch. As a lot of you already know, London looked really, really good in my prospect model. And he looks good in this new iteration of the prospect model too. He has a score of 98.2. And then his year 2 model score, which factors in a player's prospect score alongside rookie season numbers, his year 2 score was 98.7. The year 2 model is attempting to predict how well a player is going to perform in year 2 and year 3 of his NFL career. And that's by looking at max season scores by points per game during those seasons historically. Among players sort of in that elite tier since 2011, that elite tier at wide receiver, their hit rates are amazing. Of the wideouts with a year 2 score from 95 to 100 since 2011, 84% have given us a season of 14 or more PPR points per game in either year 2 or year 3. 60% of them have given us a 16 plus PPR point per game season. 40% of them have given us an 18 plus PPR point per game season. You essentially have better than 50-50 odds of getting a wide receiver 1 season out of these guys. Now, Drake London hasn't gotten you that at all. He only scored 10.9 PPR points during 2023, his second year in the league. Now, I don't usually do this because it's not like I have a year 3 model or anything. And no, I'm not creating one either. But there are some interesting comps for a player like London. Let's look at players drafted from 2011 to 2021. We'll ignore the 2022 and 2023 guys because they haven't played a full 3 years to judge them via the year 2 model yet. From 2011 to 2021, we had 6 wide receivers get to a 95 score in the year 2 model and then fail to score 13 PPR points per game in year 2. So we had these really high hopes for these guys, and then they essentially weren't even wide receiver 2s in their second year in the league. Justin Blackmon was one of them. He only played 4 total games, though, in year 2 and year 3. People will hate on the year 2 model for liking Blackmon, but he was a really good prospect who had a really solid rookie season. So Blackmon's one of the 6. Another one, Kelvin Benjamin. Benjamin, despite being a first-round pick, was looked at by the prospect model as a not very good prospect. He just objectively crushed it during his rookie year, which boosted his year 2 score. If I was doing prospecting analysis back then, I hope I would have been able to see through that. I hope that I would have seen Kelvin Benjamin as an obvious bust, or an obvious sell, I should say. But that's not really the point. He then missed his second season before scoring a little over 12 PPR points per game during his third. And then there's Jerry Jeudy. He's been kind of a bust thus far, let's just be honest. Injuries have played some role, but Jeudy just hasn't had it so far in the NFL. So those are 3 of the 6 wide receivers. 3 of the 6 wide receivers who had a year 2 score of 95 or better who were not good in year 2. The other 3, though, are Keenan Allen, Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Ayuk. Ayuk didn't get to his breakout until this past year, so after year 3 was over. Deebo Samuel was hurt during his second season, and then Keenan Allen just didn't get it done. My point here is that this may be just a slower rise than we originally anticipated with Drake London. Or that I originally anticipated. But I'd rather be early than be late. And the good news is that London's peripherals this past year, they weren't that bad. The numbers weren't as good as they were during his rookie season, where they were elite, like legitimately elite, but they were still strong. He had a solid 23% target share per game rate. His 1.86 yards per route run ranked in the 73rd percentile among wide receivers with 200 or more routes this past year, and his receiving yards per team pass attempt was well above average. A lot can change and will change in Atlanta pretty quickly. And if we're following the talent, and I think there's plenty of signs pointing to Drake London being talented, then London's someone that I want on my dynasty roster. Let's go from a higher profile name to a literal dart throw. One of the things that Rich Rebar and I talked about on last week's late round perspectives episode was these smaller running backs. Devon Achan's an obvious one. Jahmyr Gibbs, he's just a little bit undersized. You've got Keaton Mitchell too. You have these electric players who are just awesome with the ball in their hands, but they're not likely to see like Saquon Barkley level workloads. As we talked about on that episode, I think it's worth listening before listening to this one, to be honest. But as we talked about on that episode, the NFL has shifted, not with the way that they're necessarily using those running backs. The game has shifted a bit in how they're just using running backs in general. Mobile quarterbacks are becoming more common. That lowers the frequency of true elite bell cow backs. Just to give you some context, over the last 4 years, quarterbacks have seen between 15% and 16.2% of the league's rush attempts. Back in 2011 to about 2017, that number was closer to 11%. Those rush attempts are being taken from somewhere, and it's being taken from the running back position. Running back in total has seen a 12-year drop in rush share of about 7%. That obviously translates then to rushing yards too. And the share of rushing touchdowns, that's dropping as well. We used to see running backs get between 82 and 84% of the NFL's rushing touchdowns back in like the 2011 to the 2014 range. This past year, they hit a 12-year low with a 70.7% rushing touchdown share. And then here's the thing, if you look at receiving volume, that's kind of been a problem of late too. One hypothesis is that running backs have seen a decline in target share over the last 4 years or so because of the increase in mobile quarterbacks, which makes some sense. But regardless of the reason, there's been a decline. Running back target shares are dropping. So in total, when it comes to rushing and receiving, running backs are seeing smaller shares of their offenses across the NFL. So think about what that means. It means that the true bell cow backs who are seeing the typical elite bell cow usage, they're becoming even more valuable in fantasy football because they're unicorns. We've known this for a while. It's just becoming an even bigger deal. But it also means that it's now becoming easier for running backs to not get as much volume and still be relevant in fantasy football. Because now, most backs across the league aren't seeing a ton of volume. So as a result of that, it means that smaller running backs might be totally fine, even if they're not seeing that big of an increase in overall workload. Teams may see successes from players like Austin Eckler or Devon Achan, and be more willing to get their 185-pound running back a bigger workload, which would be great. But chances are, those guys will still never be true bell cows. Again, Saquon Barkley level workloads. Thankfully, in today's game, that's kind of okay. Because the bigger bodied running backs, they're seeing less volume and less goal line work too. To put that all another way, the gap between lower volume backs to medium volume backs is kind of shrinking. It's creating this environment where the true bell cow backs are even more valuable, which is crazy because they've always been really, really valuable. But think about Christian McCaffrey this year. If you had Christian McCaffrey on your fantasy team, you absolutely dominated. So running backs might be able to get by on less volume. That's why a Jahmyr Gibbs, a Devon Achane, I don't think they're sell candidates, especially Gibbs, who's only kind of part of this discussion. Keaton Mitchell seems like an arbitrage on those guys. Maybe even a Jaylen Warren type too. But I'm going to take it one step further. What about Jaleel McLaughlin? When I was researching for this episode, I was shocked to see how awesome McLaughlin's rookie season really was. He's not even in my prospect model because he wasn't at the NFL Combine, and he wasn't drafted. So he doesn't even have a year 2 score. But listen to this. As a rookie, McLaughlin beat teammates Samaje Perine and Javonte Williams in expected points added per carry, success rate, rushing yards over expected per rush, 10-plus yard run rate, 20-plus yard run rate, PFF rush grade, PFF receiving grade, PFF pass blocking grade, and he was better than Williams in yards per route run. This isn't all apples to apples, but for a rookie stepping in against 2 pretty solid non-rookies, that's super, super impressive. Now, the obvious downside here is that McLaughlin doesn't have draft capital backing him. He doesn't have the standard size that we see from fantasy relevant backs. But a player like him can still carve out a role in his offense, similar to a Keaton Mitchell or Devon Achane. And he can have fantasy relevant weeks as long as he's part of that rotation. And why wouldn't he be? Or why wouldn't he at least have a chance to be? He was a very good player in 2023. Now, I don't think a player like McLaughlin or like a Keaton Mitchell, I don't think we're going to see them be RB1s in fantasy. An Achane type, maybe. A Gibbs type, he's already proven that. But I do think a player like McLaughlin has at least a shot to come close to matching some RB2 production if things break his way. That's why he's worth throwing the dart at, and why I realized that was way too low on him before doing this episode. We go from one smaller player to the next, and that's Tank Dell. Wide receiver size isn't an input in my prospect model. We don't have to discuss that with this recommendation. So let's just focus on Dell. Dell didn't look amazingly hot in my prospect model last year, and he still doesn't look incredible in the updated prospect model. He didn't have amazing age-adjusted production, though the production profile was definitely there. But he balled out this past year. He was so good. Among first-year wide receivers since 2011 with at least 300 routes run, Dell's yards per route run rate ranked 9th best. He was one of the 30 rookie wideouts to hit a target share per game rate of 20%. I've seen a lot of people comparing and contrasting Dell to Nico Collins, which I understand. Collins had an amazing year. They're both teammates. It's natural to do that. But I almost feel the same when people compare someone like Sam Laporta to Trey McBride. Laporta did what he did in 2023 as a rookie. The fact that we're comparing Tank Dell to Nico Collins and their numbers when they were both healthy, the fact that it's a discussion tells you that Dell had a pretty unbelievable season considering it was his first year in the league. It was Nico Collins' third. And that's absolutely no shade to Collins. I would love to also have Collins on my fantasy roster. I'm just saying that it just shows that Tank Dell had an unbelievable year. Now, my year 2 model spits out what are called journey comparables. Those comps look at a player's prospect score, then they look at a player's year 2 score, and they find the closest matches. So Tank Dell entered the league with a score of 76. Now his year 2 score is almost 94. When you look at the year 2 database and find players who kind of went through a similar journey, where they had a fine but not amazing prospect score that led to a very good year 2 score, you're looking at 3 pretty obvious distinct guys: Cooper Kupp, Terry McLaurin, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Yeah, not bad. There are definitely some sites out there where Dell's properly valued. But if you can catch a manager sleeping, I'd go for it. He looks like he's going to be a productive asset as he grows with CJ Stroud. Now, I don't love going hard after running backs via trade unless I'm just in a really good spot with my dynasty roster. You can always reference my rankings to see where I have guys ranked, but as is the case each year with this show, I'm looking to pick off values deeper at the running back position as opposed to telling you to trade for someone like Breece Hall. I've talked about Jaleel McLaughlin already, and I've got one more for you. Chuba Hubbard. Right now, Hubbard's mostly an afterthought who could be looked at almost as a trade throw-in. And his numbers at face value from last year were not great. According to Next Gen Stats, he had a 38% success rate, a minus 0.13 EPA per carry rate, and a sub 4 yards per attempt rate. The Panthers' offensive situation was also terrible. Hubbard's rushing yards over expected per rush was actually plus 0.2, which was more than half of a yard higher than Miles Sanders. And Sanders was the only other player in that backfield this past year to see significant touches on the ground. And that's the other point to make here. Do I think Chuba Hubbard is replaceable? Yeah, generally speaking, I think like 95% of running backs are replaceable. I don't think Hubbard is a Jahmyr Gibbs or a Breece Hall or a Bijan Robinson level talent. But beyond those types of players, you're looking for players who will have interesting short-term volume profiles. And among guys who are essentially RB4 types in Dynasty, I think Hubbard is one of the most intriguing. The Panthers went through multiple coaching staffs this past year. One of them began to give Hubbard more work than Sanders. The other one just made Hubbard their workhorse. With the interim coaching staff this past year, Hubbard averaged a 79% running back rush share per game rate. And over his final 2 games, he saw target shares of 16% and 11%. And that was all while running a decent number of routes. That coaching staff is gone. A new one could come in and say that Miles Sanders, he's their guy. But Hubbard outpaced Sanders in every metric last season. He was chosen over Miles Sanders by multiple coaching staffs. I feel like there's at least a pretty strong argument for Hubbard over Sanders at the moment. Hubbard has one more year in his rookie contract. Sanders could hypothetically be cut, but it doesn't help their cap situation if they go in that direction. It looks like a next year thing. So if the Panthers enter this offseason or the draft with those 2 running backs, they could draft a running back to get more depth, sure. They could sign a running back, or they could just keep things the way they are. This running back draft class is not very strong, and the Panthers are in rebuild mode. That's not really the position that they need to worry about right now. So I'm trusting the fact that Hubbard is just a better player than Miles Sanders at this point, and that this coaching staff will see that. You could hypothetically get maybe low-end RB2 production from a player like Hubbard next year if things break his way. And it's for the cost of very little right now. It's a small transaction, but sometimes those are very worthwhile. I'm going to piggyback off of something that Rich Rebar said on last week's Perspectives episode, and that's with buying Noah Fant. It's a really, really good call. Fant's a free agent this year, and I know that he's disappointed, but he also hasn't been a total bust. He surprisingly has 3 50-catch seasons under his belt across his 5 years in the league. He just hasn't given us that little extra bit to be more than a low-end tight end 1 or a high-end tight end 2, or a streamer. But a change in scenery may be able to help. He's been playing alongside DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett over the last 2 years, and that was also with Jackson Smith and Jigba this past year. Peripheral numbers are going to suffer a bit when you're playing alongside talent like that. Fant ended up not running a ton of routes in that offense, culminating with just 320 this past season. He was a good prospect, though. My tight end prospect model will be part of the prospect guide this year. But way back when Fant was entering the league, he graded out as one of the best prospects in that model. Now, clearly that's a model miss, generally speaking. But people forget that he scored 9 to 10 PPR points per game in both year 2 and year 3 of his NFL career. It's not like that kind of production just grows on trees. In fact, among drafted tight ends since 2015, only George Kittle, Evan Ingram, Dallas Goedert, Mark Andrews, and TJ Hawkinson were able to do that in both year 2 and year 3. So let's throw that dart. You can get Fant as a throw-in, and I'd try to do that to see where he lands this offseason. If you read last year's late round prospect guide, then you know that my model really liked Josh Downs. One of his 3 analytical comps in that guide was Tyler Lockett. He was also in the Wan'Dale Robinson, Elijah Moore mold. But I'm focusing on Lockett because in the year 2 model, Lockett is also Josh Downs' top comp. Now, I don't know if Lockett is really Josh Downs' true future. Their rookie season peripherals, they really do look alike. They had a similar yards per route run rate, target share per game rate, points per game average. The difference is that the Colts used Downs almost exclusively in the slot this past year. He ran 81% of his routes from that area of the field. Tyler Lockett's rookie season saw him in the slot on 33% of his routes run. That's a pretty massive difference. Throughout Lockett's career, he had some seasons where his slot rate would spike, but not nearly as high as Downs' rookie season. And that does matter, because if Downs ends up not playing in two wide receiver sets, that could be somewhat of a problem moving forward. But if you're a believer in Downs' game, which I am, then you're a believer that he can win anywhere. And for the record, in 2023, Downs had a higher yards per route run on the outside than the slot, according to PFF data. Downs is my final buy candidate on today's show because I think he's a really good player. Despite often playing in three wide receiver sets, he had a respectable 20% targets per route run rate and an 18% target share this season. Those are very strong numbers for a rookie. And his year 2 score, and now sits at 92. He's got Tyler Lockett as an obvious journey comparable. Like it's almost identical when looking at their prospect scores to their year 2 scores. But he's also not that far off from Stephon Diggs. Again, I know these guys are different types of players. I'm using 2 data points for these journey comparables. It's good company to be in. I'm currently higher than the market on Josh Downs as a result. At the very least, he's going to be a good slot player in the NFL, it looks like. Upside-wise, he could develop into something even more. Now, again, you can check out my rankings on the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon by visiting lateround.com. I update them monthly. And you can compare those rankings to what the market is saying and doing to help find values that way. This is just a glimpse at some of those players. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll have a mailbag episode for you on Friday. I'll talk to you then.